Hare Krishna, dear devotees, and good morning. Thank you for joining another session of our Preaching is the Essence. We'll begin by offering our most humble obeisances to ISKCON founder Acharya, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Prachadane Nirvisesha Shunyavadi Paschitya Desha Tarane Pancha Kalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubi Evacha Patitanam Pavan Ebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhakta Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. You're there, Maharaj?
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
My humble obeisances, Maharaj.
My humble obeisance to you, Maharaj. Well, we're doing simultaneous translation, so we'll
Okay.
just straight English. Well, devotees, as we have been doing for the last 18 months, we've been interviewing a number of senior devotees, both outside the China Mission and those who serve within the China Mission. And this morning we have the great honor, good fortune, and privilege to welcome a very senior disciple of Srila Prabhupada, His Holiness Niranjana Swami Maharaj. Prabhupada attracted many moons to his movement, and certainly Niranjan Maharaj is one of those moons. He has done a variety of services through the years. Of course, joining as a young man, he was engaged in preaching work and books distribution. He served in various managerial positions. For many long years, he served as a member of the GBC, taking responsibility for certain places within Russia and, of course, Ukraine and other such places in that region. And he's an extraordinary personality. I'm not going to say more than that because I'm going to start asking him about his journey, how he originally came to Krishna consciousness. How were you first introduced? And tell us about kind of what it was like in the early days.
Thank you, Giridhari Maharaj. The devotees know that you and I took sannyas together also in Mayapur in 1986.
I don't know how many know that. No.
Yes. Lord Chaitanya's quincentennial celebration.
Yeah.
Had the great fortune of being together for that event. Well, first, before I begin answering your question, I just want to say that I request you to please tell me if I extend beyond what you wish me to speak about, because there was a lot to speak about in those early days, and sometimes I can get a little bit nostalgic. So
Yes.
please be careful. I mean, to not allow me to go beyond my limits when I start talking about the early days, so that I can stick to the schedule that you have for this event.
Sure. I will do that. I have a fair amount of experience, having interviewed Indra Swami and many others who have a tendency to embellish quite a bit. So
Yeah,
we'll try to keep you within our
focus.
line here. Yeah.
Focus.
Yeah.
So I started visiting. Well, actually, I should go back. Sometimes people ask me when's the first time I met Srila Prabhupada.
Mm.
And so I oftentimes tell them that my first meeting with Srila Prabhupada was in 1972. And Then the next question obviously is, where do you meet him? And then my response is, in a bookstore. And and then, what was Prabhupada doing in a bookstore? And my response is, he was sitting on a shelf. And because that was my first meeting, undoubtedly. I happened to wander into a bookstore in 1972. I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. And I was looking for a book on yoga. And I went into the yoga section. And after scanning through the various books in the yoga section, I found a copy of the old Macmillan Bhagavad Gita as it is, sitting there.
Mm.
And I looked at the picture inside, and I saw a picture of a yogi sitting in meditation, going up ultimately to picture of Radha and Krishna. And I said, this looks like an interesting book of yoga, on yoga.
Mm.
And I purchased it. And well, I learned, maybe it was about 20 years later, that that book wasn't even part of the inventory of the bookstore. That one devotee who was Washington, D.C., happened to walk into the bookstore, and he just kind of set it there on the bookshelf. And I picked it up and purchased it from his just putting it there in the bookstore. And even though it wasn't even part of the bookstore's inventory, of course, they charged me for it, the price on the back of the book. But that was my first meeting with Prabhupada, was in 1972. And I read every evening after work, I would read a little bit from Bhagavad Gita. And I found, of course, as most individuals who seriously were searching at that particular time, which was quite common in the early 70s, late 60s, that many of us were looking for spiritual alternatives. And I found Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita to be very compelling. And gradually it was in
Okay,
late.
Maharaj. So, okay, so your first introduction, you met Prabhupada sitting on the shelf, and he spoke to you. So you're reading the Gita. Was there something that struck you, a particular verse, phrase, purport, philosophical point? Did something like really kind of strike a chord with you?
Well, really, I I wasn't any particular verse that struck a chord with me. It was more the introduction than anything else.
Oh.
Because Prabhupada just seemed to present something in such a cohesive whole that
Mm.
it was sort of like the introduction in itself was so compelling because it was Prabhupada.
Mm.
And Prabhupada's, I would say, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was his purity of purpose in
Mm.
the Bhagavad Gita
Mm.
that captivated my interest. And many times I found myself asking myself a question. This is the one thing that I really remember. I would ask myself the question, how do I know he's not pulling the wool over my eyes?
Mm.
Because I was a real searcher. I
Mm.
had studied many spiritual books. I went through the whole gamut, before I read Bhagavad Gita as it is. I read Paramahansa Yogananda, I read Ramdas, I read Carlos Castaneda, I was reading Alan Watts. I mean, I was really into studying Eastern philosophy at the time,
Mm.
but it was Prabhupada. It was Prabhupada's introduction I found that really was most compelling, because I couldn't I couldn't answer the question. There's no way to know Prabhupada's pulling the wool over my eyes unless I just kind of pursue it. So that's what I did. I pursued it, and I read the Bhagavad Gita. I finished it, and then I wrote to the BBT for Srimad Bhagavatam Volume 1, and I wrote and for Krishna book. And this is before I ever met, a devotee, quote unquote, a devotee. I'd never been to the temple. In fact, previous to that exposure, I had been heckling devotees in places that I had met them in Boston. And in fact, I remember in 1970, when I was doing my registration in college, there was a devotee there with a book table at registration, and I remember just I was thinking, these people look ridiculous. I just was not interested at all. But Prabhupada did his magic. He did his magic.
Yeah.
And he worked his way into my life in the most profound way, because I realized that I can't challenge Prabhupada. The only thing I can do at this point on is just I have to keep on going. So I just continued to read.
Yeah. Interesting point about receiving the book. You know, the story you've told thus far kind of mirrors my own, and I think many other devotees. I also met Prabhupada in a bookshelf. It was a Bhagavad Gita, that particular version as well. I also wrote to the BBT to get more, more books. I actually received my first beads from the BBT, assortment of books, probably cassette tapes at the time. There was a few cassette tapes that were available of lectures and everything.
Right.
At the time, I don't know if it was the same person, but Swarup Prabhu was the person who was the corresponding secretary at that time in Los Angeles. But interesting. So the books are really the basis.
Books are the basis, Maharaj. It's my conviction. I mean, it's my conviction. Especially when I hear sometimes, well, I don't even want to say it. Sometimes you hear devotees saying that Prabhupada's books are a little bit unapproachable at these times. Like I just laugh. I mean, of course, I could potentially get angry, but I laugh. Who are we to approach? Who was I? I was a hippie. I was.
Yeah, many of us. Okay, you received the book, you're reading, you write the BBT, you received the first canto of Bhagavatam. What happens next?
Gradually, in late 1972, I've made my first visit. Well, actually, no, I did make my first visit. What happened is I used to live in a place called Cape Cod. It was maybe about 80, 90 miles out of Boston. I was building houses as a carpenter. So, again, reading Bhagavad Gita every night when I would come home from work. So I decided one day I wanted to go and visit the temple in Boston. I drove all the way into Boston, and looked all around and I couldn't find it. There was no Google Maps those days. So I drove back, and then I made another attempt some weeks later. I drove in, and finally I found it, and I parked the car across the street from the temple, and I just looked at the building for some time. I looked at the sign. There was a big sign, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, on top. It was a small building, not that small, but it was. I was looking at it and I was thinking, if I go in there, I don't think I'm ever going to come out. I was already that convinced. Sometimes people say that that devotees are getting brainwashed, by meeting the other devotees. I was already brainwashed by Prabhupada long before I came to the temple, and I never met any devotee. So I was thinking like that for about an hour or 2 hours. I sat in front of the building, and I turned around and I drove all the way back down to Cape Cod, because I was thinking, I'm not sure if I'm ready for it yet.
Oh.
So then it was the third visit. Third visit, I finally drove in. I got enough courage to go inside. And sure enough, I didn't stay. I had certain things that were kind of binding me, attaching me
Yeah.
to continue to stay outside. and it took me some time to overcome them. It took me many months to overcome some of those obstacles. But gradually, I think it was in 1973, after regular visitations to the temple, and there was one devotee in particular. His name was Keshava, our god brother Keshava, who's Karandar's brother.
Mm.
He was living in the Boston temple at the time, and he had spent time with Prabhupada, and he really took me under his wing as a friend.
Mm.
I have to confess, it was because of Keshava. I mean, I looked at him with such awe and reverence, and he would never let me get like that. He would just always be my friend. And the only thing he would do was just tell me stories about Prabhupada and treat me like an equal, and encourage me and inspire me. And because of that friendship that I made with him, he told me, he said, my name was Neil. He said, Neil, mark my word, you're going to be a preacher in Prabhupada's movement. You're going to give your life to Prabhupada. He said, I can tell. He said, I'm going to Guyana from here. I'm going to open up some preaching there. When you make the decision to do what's your calling, come to the temple, get yourself shaved up, get a dhoti, and come meet me in Guyana. We'll preach together. And that's why I joined the temple. That's why I joined the temple, because I was all ready to go and to join Keshava. And but when I got to the temple, finally in 1973, and the temple president at the time said, I didn't have a lot. I had a sleeping bag, I had a guitar, which I gave to my stepbrother, and I had a dog, which I left. Those are some of the attachments that I was holding on to. Yeah. And a sleeping bag, and the temple president said, "No, you're not going anywhere. You're staying here." And I just surrendered. I joined in the Boston temple.
So that point of someone kind of extending their hand to you, I mean, that made all the difference. Similar experience, like with many of us, that same experience. A devotee just was there, took us under their wing and really nurtured us in various ways. And I'd have to say, and as what I got from what you said thus far, it would have been difficult if someone hadn't done that. If we would have just come into a situation where everyone was kind of whatever, not really very personal, as we can sometimes experience in various places, and no one is really connecting with us, kind of like taking an interest in us as an individual. I don't know. I think for me it would have been difficult in those early, years if someone hadn't extended their hand like that.
I fully agree, Maharaj. I fully agree. And it's it's one of the I'd have to say compelling reasons why I'm so much keen on devotee care and personal dealings with
Right.
devotees, and how new people coming to Krishna consciousness really have to find a kind of a relationship, a trusting relationship, because
Right.
it was my own experience. Because of that relationship, I mean, I have to confess, one of the biggest, I would say, disappointments in my life as a devotee is that I never, after Keshava went to Guyana, and I was joining the temple and restricted from going to join him, he somehow moved on to preaching in other areas,
Mm.
and I never saw him again.
Mm.
And when he left his body, I just cried and cried like a baby, because I never thanked him. I never thanked him for, like, I just it was really emotional trauma for me. I never thanked him for what he did for me,
Yeah.
And it was like everything. It was my whole life. Introduction to Prabhupada was because of his personal care.
Yeah. Yeah. Indeed. Well, you've joined, and like many of the early devotees, you were engaged in various services. You want to describe a little bit of what those early services were, and which ones that you seem to, I don't know, excel in or gravitate towards. I mean, of course, we were always kind of doing the needful and didn't always have a choice as to what service we could perform. We just kind of did whatever
Well,
was necessary, I guess.
there were two qualifications that I had in the early days when I first joined the temple.
Hmm.
One of them was I was a carpenter before I came to Krishna consciousness. I used to build houses,
Hmm.
and the other one was I had a driver's license, which at that particular time nobody had in the temple. So my first services, uh, well, here's an interesting story. Even before that, it's a story that it's a good story.
Please,
Devotees like it.
go ahead.
My second visit to the temple, the first service I was given, was I was living in a sort of like a hippie commune, and many of us would live together in a house on Cape Cod when we were all, you know, do what you want, you know, be here now. And but we were all vegetarians, and that was sort of like a a criteria for being socially accepted at that time. We were all vegetarians. Why we were vegetarians? Because we all had our own dogs, and because I had a dog and everyone else had a dog, and we all became convinced that we would never kill our own dog. Why should we kill any other animal? That was sort of like our creed,
Mm.
as amongst ourselves. We were dog lovers and strict vegetarians, and and so I used to cook. When I started visiting the temple, I used to cook for myself. But one of the kind of standards, or should I say lack of standards in our commune, was nobody would clean up after themselves. There was no kind of do what you like. This was kind of like the prevailing mood. And if you want to cook, you got to clean. So I remember going into the kitchen, and the philosophy I was learning by my visits to the temple is that you have to cook for Krishna in a clean kitchen.
Mm.
And I used to become very resentful of the fact that before I would be able to cook something for Krishna, that I had to clean up after everybody else. And then so when I came to the temple, was like the second visit, the devotee and said to me, "Would you like to do some service?" So I said, "Sure," because I understood service was something we should do. So he brought me into the back room, and there was this huge stack of pots, and huge, even bigger than the pots and dishes and everything else I was cleaning at the commune.
Mm.
And I was thinking, what kind of jokester is Krishna? You know, because I used to resentfully clean all those pots, and now I'm coming in with a bigger stack of pots and dishes to clean for Krishna. And I was kind of thinking, phew. And then one devotee came over to me while I was washing, and he looked at me with a big smile on his face, and he said, "When you clean Krishna's pots, you clean your heart."
Mm.
And I remember this was the first service I actually did, cleaning Krishna's pots. And when the devotee said, "When you clean Krishna's pots," I was thinking, yeah, these are not ordinary pots. These are Krishna's pots. I've been waiting for lifetimes
Mm.
to clean Krishna's pots.
Mm.
And my mind did a full 180 degrees, you know, full circle, I should say.
Mm.
That, and I became so blissful cleaning Krishna's pots. That was my first service and transformation of consciousness in service, getting the opportunity to not clean the commune's pots and dishes, but to clean Krishna's pots.
Mm.
So I remember that first experience. And then as I was started to visit the temple, it became a regular service until the devotees found out I was a carpenter.
Mm.
When they found out I was a carpenter, then even before I moved into the temple, I was doing all kinds of different kinds of renovations for the temple. And then when I moved into the temple, the renovations would continue. I lived in it was used to be the press, ISKCON Press, the building we had. It was actually previously had been uh, what are those buildings called where they bring a funeral service, a funeral parlor.
Okay.
and they used to have these pulleys where they bring up the coffin into and everything. So they wanted, and the press was down in the basement, and the basement was really, really horrendous. And in fact, when I first moved into the temple, I was told that you can't move into the temple. You have to sleep in the basement first. They tested me to see how sincere I was. So I would sleep in the basement in a sleeping bag on the cold stone floor. And I did that for quite some time, for some weeks. And I had to beg them, please let me shave my head. And they say, no, you stay in the basement for some time and continue like this. So gradually they had me renovate the basement and to make it nice. And then I think it was after about 2 weeks, I moved. Finally, I was able to move upstairs into the ashram, and then I had to beg them to shave my head, and I was a very long-haired hippie, and that was a very amazing experience. Also, getting shaved up in the days before they had the electric buzzers, and they had these little hand clippers, and they spent. Srinath, my godbrother Srinath, kind of shaved me up. It took about 2 hours. And I remember the first day I shaved up, it looked like I had been fighting in a battlefield. My head was all scarred. And then they said, okay, now you're going to go out and distribute Prabhupada's books. So that was the first day I shaved up. I was sent out to distribute Back to Godhead magazines on a street corner in a nearby city. And that was very difficult for me, needless to say. Very, very difficult for me. I was not very outgoing at the time. I was somewhat introverted. And gradually I was asked to do it again and again, and I would sometimes find myself crying, not feeling any sense of compassion whatsoever, and being completely unable, because Prabhupada said, in the early days they'll ridicule us, and these were the ridiculing days for us in America. I mean, going out with shaved head and tilak and dhoti on the streets, and facing a lot of ridicule. So sometimes I would have to come back, and they would give me other services to do because I couldn't stay out and do it full time yet. I did come to that point. But I had, in the course of services I had done over the years, I would say over the first couple of years, I had taken every service possible, from temple carpenter to temple commander, and whereas I was driving a lot of the devotees around, because I said I had the only license in the temple at that time in 1973, and then cleaning the temple, course, temple commander in those days meant you
Yeah.
did everything yourself.
Had the experience myself.
And then dabbling with book distribution, coming back again, I became the treasurer, and then I became a cook, and then in 1970, 19, I guess it was 1970. Oh no, I became the Bhakti director in 1978 because I was a book distributor and Sankirtan leader from 1975, 76, 77. I was doing traveling Sankirtan. And then the temple president asked me to come back from traveling Sankirtan and said, "You'll distribute more books if you make new devotees and train them up as book distributors." So then I became the Bhakti leader. And then in 1978, I became a Bhakti leader in New York. I was transferred to New York to be the Bhakti leader in a temple on West 55th Street, where there were about 250 devotees living in the temple, that big skyscraper building, 11-story building. I was the Bhakti leader there. And then I was sent to become the temple president in Boston in 1979. So this is a gradual evolution of my services. There are a lot of stories I could tell in between, but I didn't. I left them out because I'm sure there are other things that you want to inquire about.
Well, I noted you said that you had given your guitar to you said it was your stepbrother, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. You obviously had some musical, at least aptitude. I mean, and so when did that come out? I mean, in your own kind of practice of Krishna consciousness, you know, the musical aspect, leading kirtan, or picking up harmonium, mridanga, and all of that. Did that come right from the beginning, or?
Well, uh, yeah, it did. It did because again, I didn't take the initiative to do it, but others saw it in me.
Mm.
So I did have a musical aptitude. In fact, when I was in college, I was initially in the college as a electrical engineering major, but I kind of dropped out of engineering and I took liberal arts, and then I was majoring in music theory,
Okay.
and I decided to switch to music theory because even as a 5-year-old child, I was playing piano. I was
Okay.
under a teacher, and I had guitar lessons as a young child, and I had a kind of an aptitude for that. So others saw that in me.
Mm.
A person who saw it was Adi Keshava, actually,
Mm.
and I have to confess that because he was somewhat close with Vishnu John Swami, and because I met Vishnu John Swami in 1970, early 1973, I think, when he was in Boston with Radha Damodar, with I became very attracted to his kirtan, to his personality, and somehow Krishna arranged it that I was still visiting the temple at that time. The Krishna arranged it that Vishnu John Swami needed a ride somewhere, so he and I, just the two of us, went together to and I spent some time with him, and I would say it was because of that association and because of Adi Keshava being close with Vishnu John Swami, he decided that he wanted me to learn how to play mridanga and play the harmonium as things that he had learned from Vishnu John Swami.
Okay.
In fact, the way I learned mridanga, this is a far out story. This is how I learned mridanga.
Mm.
It was in 1970. It was before Adi Keshava had actually associated with Vishnu John Swami, but he saw it in me, a potential. He said to me, I can't remember, it was 73. Yeah, so I wasn't even initiated yet. I was still bhakta. He said, I want to teach you how to play mridanga. So we sat down together and he taught me the mantra, Tini Tini Ta Teo Tanakate Ditya Ditya Da. And he showed it to me on the mridanga. And then he handed me the mridanga and said, now you try it. So I did, I chanted the mantra, Tini Tini Ta Teo Tanakate Ditya Ditya Da. He said, no, that's not right. He said, give me the mridanga. So he took the mridanga back and spent some time showing me beat again, and then gave me the mridanga back and said, okay, try it one more time. He said, yeah, that's it, you got it. And then he said, let me show you one more beat. He showed me one more beat, and he threw the mridanga in my lap and said, okay, take out the Harinam party. And that very day, I took the mridanga out on Harinam with the other devotees who were going out with me. And I was Tini Tini Ta Teo Tenakate Dich. I was leading the Harinam.
Just with that beat alone.
Just that beat alone. And then what he would do is when we would come back in the evening, because we had the devotional sandwich, the morning program in the evening, we all come back in the evening from the evening program. He would force me to pick up the second mridanga, and he would force me to play with him.
Mm.
And I would just follow him.
Mm.
And that's how I learned the mridanga. And same with the harmonium.
Mm.
He learned, sometime later, he learned some melodies from Vishnu Jan Swami. And many of the early melodies that I learned were from Vishnu Jan Swami. And I had a sort of like a natural aptitude for music, so it wasn't very difficult. If it was here, to get it from here to the harmonium was not difficult for me.
Mm.
And that's how I kind of learned how to play different melodies on the harmonium.
Nice. So, of course, you were performing all of those services in the United States and all. And at what point did you kind of get involved with the other side of the world? What were the circumstances?
Yeah. Well, I first visited in 1982 when I was the temple president of Boston. I was looking to broaden my exposure to ISKCON. And I asked the then GBC at that time if I could travel in Europe and visit different temples. And he allowed me to.
Hmm.
So I went to, it was in 1982, I was still a brahmachari. And I visited many of the temples in Europe at the time, in France, in Germany, in Sweden, and not only that, but because I was a brahmachari leader in America, the GBCs at that time of the two zones took interest in me. Mm-hmm. And thinking, what's a brahmachari traveling around Europe? He must be looking for another place to go. So, and Kiritrajs, who was formerly my temple president in Boston, was also in Italy, and they were looking to recruit me. So, but then that was kind of my first exposure outside of Europe. I went back and continued as a temple president. Although I was looking, because, but I won't go into all those details of the reasons why I was looking, but I decided not to. I decided to stay and to continue my services, but I wanted to preach more. Okay. Being a manager for me was something that I felt was not my calling. Mm. especially to be a temple president. Brahmachari, I felt was not my calling. Let's put it this way. Some of the women took interest in the thought that because I was being nice to them, that they misread that as something else, of being nice to them, because it was my responsibility as the temple president to be nice with them. And I started to think, this is not very compatible. I should be spending my time outside the temple more preaching. And I started doing that as a temple president. I started traveling more and kind of dividing my responsibilities. And I started preaching more in the region, visiting people in the region, and expanding the preaching in the New England region. The temples are, different. There were no other temples, just Boston Temple. So because of that preaching, the GBC at the time just said, maybe you should take sannyas. So I took sannyas in 1986. And then the way I got involved in preaching in the former Soviet Union was because, well, the way it started was I had no particular interest or calling to do it. I was satisfied just traveling and preaching in the New England area, and I did make some visits again to Europe and preaching as a sannyasi in 1986 after taking sannyas. But in 1988, it was the first year that the Soviet devotees came to India, and there was a person who, a friend of the movement, a wealthy friend that I knew personally, who met them at that time. And he happened to be in India at that time, and he was just so attracted to them. He was very inspired by the sacrifices that the Soviet devotees had made, that he was talking to me about maybe visiting the Soviet Union. And I encouraged him, because I thought maybe if he visited the Soviet Union, that maybe there's something he could do there, because he was quite wealthy. I had never asked him for money at all, and I was never interested in taking any of his money. And but he said, I would like to go. He said, but I'll only go if you go with me. So I called Kiritrajs, who was the GBC at the time, and said, we have a wealthy businessman. And the interesting thing about this wealthy businessman also is that he used to be in the 60s and early 70s, I believe. He was one of the Maharishi's top leaders in the Maharishi's movement. He was also, one of his, I would say, managers of the institution. And the Maharishi told him personally to help Prabhupada. It was very interesting. It was something that he directly told him to help Prabhupada. So that was why he started visiting the temple. And this opportunity, to visit the Soviet Union was a place that he knew Prabhupada had visited in 1971, and how Krishna consciousness, was seeded by Prabhupada in 1971. He took it as sort of like an inspiration, a challenge and an inspiration. And I didn't know that, but he really wanted to do something. So I said, maybe, okay, if you won't go without me, I'll ask Giridhari, if he needs someone to go. And Giridhari said, Maharaj, there's only 2 people at this time going in the Soviet Union. We're looking for somebody to go. And to go to the Soviet Union during those years, the Soviet years, was very expensive, because you had to go as part of a tour. You couldn't go just, it's not a question of just buying a ticket. You had to go as a tour, and you had to pay, sometimes $200, $300 a night for these dingy hotel rooms. And you had to pay in advance for the whole tour. And it was quite costly. Some of those tours cost like $5,000. And to find somebody who could, himself pay for those tours was not so easy. But here was this friend who wanted to go on a tour and wanted me to go with him, and he was ready to pay. So he would pay, he and I would go together, and we made these arrangements to visit the Soviet Union at that time as tourists. And that's because it was our initial introduction into the Soviet Union was such that it was very appealing to him. He saw the potential, and he saw how the devotees in the Soviet Union at that time responded to the message of Krishna consciousness. He became inspired to seed, the growth of Krishna consciousness by purchasing or giving donations to purchase buildings when things opened up. And it was an opportunity to purchase buildings. You could get buildings for a few $1,000s. You could get a building. And in different places he traveled with me, he was always very, very eager to give donations to seed the purchase of different buildings to start Prabhupada's, of course, Prabhupada's movement had already gone. I was riding the crest of the wave. Obviously, it was done by many of the Soviet devotees themselves who made the big sacrifices under the circumstances that they were preaching. And I just came in on the crest of the wave, of Prabhupada's preaching and his books. And sometimes I found myself in those early years for me, as I would oftentimes confess that these Soviet people were so interested in hearing Krishna consciousness, so eager to hear about Krishna. We would gather together in a small flat or in the forest. Sometimes we had to meet in the forest, and people would come and they'd be ready to sit for 6 hours, even in the most inconvenient, austere conditions. They would sit for 6 hours and just nonstop and ask questions. Then we'd have a little feast of like a potato and a piece of bread. And then we go again. And somehow I felt like that Krishna was reciprocating with their desires to hear about him. I happened to be at the right place at the right time, and I was getting caught in the crossfire. That's all. This is how I experienced it. I happened to be at the right place at the right time, their sincere desire to hear about Krishna. I happened to be a person who could say something, and Krishna was somehow sending me there to reciprocate. He wanted to reciprocate with them and used me. I was just caught in the crossfire. And that's how I experienced the early visits to the Soviet Union at that time. And it would just, we did it. Charlie and I went several times. We went on longer tours to different cities. I was the first foreign preacher to go into Siberia and to go into Kazakhstan, because nobody had ventured to those places before, but we wanted to expand our tours into these places. And this is how things gradually, when Kiritrajs in 1991, Kiritrajs decided, he made some big sacrifices because he spent 10 years, from early 1980s to he was, he was blacklisted in 1982. He couldn't get into the Soviet Union. Both he and Harikesh were blacklisted. So he had to do the whole campaign of free the Soviet Hare Krishnas, and he was overseeing everything for at least a decade. And that in 1991, when things started to open up, he decided, he told me confidentially, he said, I've spent 10 years of my life and dedicated so much to this service. He said, but I have two children that don't even know who their father is. He said, I think, Maharaj, I want to let my children, they're grown up now, and that I want to let them know they have a father. And he personally asked me, will you take responsibilities in the Soviet Union? He asked me if I would take responsibilities in Ukraine and in Belarus, Moldova, and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And it's sort of like kind of unfolded that way, with Kiritrajs' request to bring in others to take responsibility for this, for the Soviet Union as things were opening. And I oftentimes make it very clear. I feel it's a very, very important point that devotees have to understand that Giriraj Prabhu and Harikesh Prabhu, what they did, for those years, Giriraj was an unsung hero. He was an unsung hero. They owe so much to what he did. He was like a father, to many of the early, pioneers of the Krishna consciousness movement in the early 80s of the Soviet Union. And I was somehow just, I saw myself as simply as serving him. And sometimes people say, when I hear people say Narendra Swami, so many sacrifices he made and dangerous situation that he was undergoing. No, it wasn't dangerous for me. What was dangerous was for the devotees themselves. They were meeting the challenges. So anyways, they were the ones that
they were the real pioneers.
They were the real pioneers. I was just somehow at the right place at the right time, watching Prabhupada do his magic in the same way that he did to me in 1972. Watching Prabhupada do his magic and watching his books, just transform people's lives, and hearing the testimonies one after the other, after the other, after the other, of people's lives being transformed by Prabhupada's magic. And that's what was inspiring for me. That's what really, really, really motivated me. Watching Prabhupada do his magic. And he knew what he was doing when he planted the seed in 1971. When he met, the first devotees, Ananta, Shanti, and he empowered him in his first visit to Moscow.
Some devotees may not know so much, but so Prabhupada visits Moscow, 1971, correct?
Right. He visited Moscow and to meet Professor Kotovsky, who was an Indologist, and on those, conditions, he was invited to come as a guest scholar of Vedic wisdom, and he was very limited as to where he could go, what he can do, and that's all there in the Lilamrita, the whole story of what the conditions Prabhupada was living at the time. But Shyamasundar, as we know, was traveling with Prabhupada, and Shyamasundar would kind of present, Prabhupada. I remember close with Shyamasundar. We would sit and sometimes talk about those early days. And I would listen to him tell stories of those days when Prabhupada was in Moscow. He even used the expression, he said Prabhupada was, he said meeting this Professor Kotovsky was not enough for Prabhupada. He would say Prabhupada was antsy. He had to preach. And I knew, he said, I knew that I wasn't serving Prabhupada unless I kept Prabhupada busy. And he was looking for different ways for Prabhupada to fully utilize his time to his full capacity during his few days visit to Moscow. So he describes how he, when the Shyamasundar was out in line, to purchase, I think something, he was out, I can't remember what it was that he was getting. And because people had to stand in line in those days in the Soviet Union to get certain everything, it was line and the lines could be sometimes quite long too. So two boys came up to him, recognized him, and they were what Americans represented to the Soviets at that time was the dangerous things that the Soviets perceived was what was it? Rock and roll music, jeans, and something else. I can't remember what it was. I'm sorry, I'm going blank at the moment. But they were asking him if he had any of these things. And Shyamasundara's response to them was, no, I don't. He says, but I have a guru. Would you like to meet him? And they said, sure. And Shyamasundar took that as an opportunity to bring these two boys. One of them was an Indian boy, and the other one was a local Russian person. I mean, not a devotee at the time. And he brought them back to Prabhupada's room. He was staying in the Hotel National. Prabhupada gave the example. In fact, when he met Ananta Shanti for the first time, he gave the example. He says, when you cook a pot of rice, you take one grain and you see one grain is cooked and you immediately know the whole pot is cooked. So Prabhupada said about Ananta Shanti, he said simply by talking to Ananta Shanti, he could understand that the Soviet people, they were ready for Krishna consciousness. So Prabhupada invested more than one day. He invited him back, invested more than one day with this Ananta Shanti, and he would preach to him. He gave him everything that he could possibly give him. And then by the time Prabhupada left, he initiated him. And from this one person, Prabhupada, of course, gradually he began preaching. Gradually, Prabhupada's books, they got in, but in a very clandestine way, and they would arrange for photocopying them, and by making photocopies of the books, then they would gradually go out and distribute photocopies of the books to others. And this is how Kiritrajs and Harikesh Maharaj at the time gradually began spreading Krishna consciousness in the 80s. And things were done in that way until in the late 80s when I started to come into the picture. As I said, I just rode the crest of the wave.
There seemed to be a real kind of like eagerness on the part of the Russian people at the time. They seemed to be almost greedy for Krishna consciousness or learning. And doesn't seem we've seen that same kind of eagerness almost anywhere in the world. What do you attribute that to?
I'm asked this question a lot. I would say, unfortunately, I was quoted. Well, anyways, I was I was quoted on this on a famous television show in 1990, 92, I think it was. Uh, uh, there was a television show in America called Street Stories, and as things were opening up, I was met in Moscow, and they would ask me different questions, and I was interviewed. I was one of the main interviewees for their television show, and I answered this question for them, and they were motivated. They hung on this particular statement that I made for the wrong purpose. But I'll expand on it. I made a statement then that my experience was in the early Soviet times that people were so hungry for anything that wasn't Soviet propaganda. And it came to the point that my observation was that sometimes they couldn't distinguish between what was divine and what was just not Soviet propaganda. If it was not Soviet propaganda, it was divine.
Mm. Any alternative.
Any alternative was descending from a place beyond. So it must be divine. So, and so that was my initial observation. And I saw that even sometimes people were motivated in that way. But it was Prabhupada's purity that I began to perceive that, yeah, but how can people stick? Right? How can people stick to that transfer? What they thought initially was just divine because it wasn't Soviet propaganda. How is it they could take to it in such a very natural way and be ready to undergo the kind of austerities that they were ready to undergo and stick with it? It's because they found in Prabhupada the same thing that I found, that challenge as you like, you cannot disprove. You cannot disprove what Prabhupada is saying. You can only question it or doubt it, and Prabhupada had a way of saying, okay, if you want to disprove it, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. You have to see for yourself. And what happened is that I began to observe that the Soviet people had a very natural inclination. Why? Because they were ready to undergo austerities because that's all they knew. Introduction of austerities in their life was not something you had to force upon them. They knew it. And Krishna says, all that you do, all that you offer and give away, as well as austerities you perform, do it for me. Prabhupada gave them a purpose for their austerities. So it's natural for them to undergo austerities. And they did undergo austerities. But it was natural. What were they giving up? For many, they didn't have to give up a lot in that sense. Independence. But even that they didn't have. During Soviet times. It was a struggle.
So it seems initially they were kind of looking for something, as you said, divine, anything outside of what they had experienced. But it seems that they really did find something divine here, and they started to get a taste for it.
They found something divine. They got a taste for it. And not only that, but what was so, for me, was so beautiful to see is that older people, professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, they were so attracted to Prabhupada's message, and they were ready. They were ready. Elderly people, I was watching them taking the beads, sitting and chanting japa, and with heart, tears. Like finally, they had given already so many years of their life to an austerity and to and to an ideal that they knew there must be something higher. And then for Prabhupada to come in and to show them, yes, Krishna, tears. I'd see them, tears. They're emotional. They are emotional. And I believe that Prabhupada stimulated that emotions, in a way that gave them an opportunity to transform those emotions to spiritual emotions, which was what everyone's looking for. And I would say that one of the things that the Soviet Union, the greatest contribution to the world, the Soviet Union, greatest contribution to the world was they created a very fertile place for Prabhupada's mission. The very fertile place. Because they were suppressed for so long. After 70 years or 60, 70 years of suppression, they created the most fertile soil for Prabhupada's purity to take root. And they're so fortunate that, I mean, beyond that, someone may say, okay, that was over 30 years ago. Why are they still? Something is there. I'm not going to speculate what's there. Maybe because, that it's still there, that innate desire to hear more, and again, maybe to also see that some of them saw that the Western ideals that came in, which they thought was divine, was not all they took it to be. They said, no, this is not really these Western ideals of let's not get into that, but
that became as much of a disappointment as the other thing that they were subjected to for 70 years. It was just another disappointment.
Yes. And Prabhupada had the real thing. So, of course, that was one of the things that I learned coming in at the time, was as to how to preserve the real thing so that we don't make similar mistakes that we've made in the past. And of course, that's where devotee care really became a very integral part of our mission.
Right. So, Mars, when does devotee care actually enter? I mean, was that still in the kind of like the earlier days, or was this when you got more focused on Ukraine? So at what point does devotee care enter into your whole kind of preaching scheme?
Well, I'll go back to, I knew Radhanath Maharaj from the 80s. In fact, before I took sannyas, Satsvarup Maharaj told me to travel with him. And it was in 84, maybe 84. Could have been 84, 85. I can't remember. I took sannyas in 86. But I spent several weeks traveling with Radhanath Maharaj. So because of that relationship I had with him, that even for a period of time when he was not so much involved, he was kind of outside for reasons which are not necessary to go into. But I would visit him, and in 1992, I think it was, I visited Radha Gopinath Mandir. It was Chaupati at the time. And I spent several days there. And they had, quote unquote, the counselor system there.
Mm.
And I saw there something that I felt was kind of something that I could very much relate to, of trying to avoid some mistakes of the past, of creating a sense of camaraderie amongst the devotees, a sense of care, relationships amongst devotees, something that would, keep them inspired, not just by the concept of themselves being a disciple with a guru, but more having relationships that, and the guru who teaches that relationships is an important part of me being your guru.
Mm.
If you want to be my disciple, you have to know how to have relationships. And I kind of was inspired by that. I was very inspired by that.
Mm.
And I saw, just from the few days I spent there, I saw something that was very attractive. And I was thinking how to apply that kind of a principle in the course of my preaching. I was, at that time, I was a GBC of Ukraine. I was giving a lot of focus on Ukraine, because that's, as I said, Kiritrajs had requested me in 1991 to become the GBC of Ukraine. And gradually, I actually became involved in also in western part of Russia. But Ukraine was sort of like a point of focus to me. And as I explained in my interview yesterday, that one of the challenges that I had to confront when things began opening up in the early 90s is that people could become leaders very easily.
Mm.
Very easily. And all you had to do was have Prabhupada's books, go someplace with Prabhupada's books, give some talks, and because the area was just wide open, many people would go and become leaders, but some of them just didn't really have the proper leadership understanding.
Mm.
They felt that leader meant, I have so many stripes on my shoulder, and now you surrender to me, and I felt that this was something that could be potentially dangerous without sufficient training of how to take care of the people, because taking care of devotees means not that you just take somebody in, engage them during their years of vitality and youth, and then they're disposable when they are no longer, instrumental for serving your ideals. You can dispose them, and because there's so many more that will come, you can dispose of them and then forget about them and just keep on. There's somehow the revolving door concept of making devotees in Krishna consciousness was something I didn't want to see happen. And I wanted to see that once people come to Krishna consciousness, that they're at Prabhupada's lotus feet for life. And they come, they should give their life, they should have a future, they should grow old, and they should die in the association of devotees. We have to give them that kind of long life in the association of devotees, and I didn't, the dispensable devotee during his vital years, that concept to me had to be something that was kind of uprooted, and the leadership had to know this is not the direction we're going to move into in our efforts to spread Krishna consciousness here. And devotee care kind of evolved because of that kind of internal conviction that I had. And but I had, because I had already been exposed. I saw something that was really attractive. And I was thinking, yes, this is something I should try to replicate, but I can't do it myself. And I invited Radhanath Maharaj because of my friendship. Can you please come to Kiev? In the late 1990s, I mean, it was probably, I think, 1997, because for years we were kind of struggling with this kind of training with new devotees. I asked him if he would speak about this and give simply talks about it, and we recorded them all, and I began distributing them to other people. I began preaching it myself, this concept. Some places it would take hold, some places it didn't take hold so well. And of course, one of the challenges that I had to meet, two challenges I had to meet. The first challenge is that people were thinking, oh, that can be done in India. This is not India. This was the first challenge, to convince people that this is not an Indian phenomena where people are naturally, have culture, and naturally they have, they know how to serve prasadam, and they know how to have friendly relationships. People thought this was, Radhanath Maharaj did it in India, but how can we do that here? This is Ukraine. And we had to disprove that it's not just an Indian phenomena. It can be replicated in another place if the right consciousness is there and the right mood is there. And then the next challenge I had to confront was where devotees were thinking that, oh, this is Naranjana Swami's thing for taking care of his disciples. That's all. He's just wanting to create a system so he can take care of his own disciples. And therefore, he's trying to train people to become, counselors. And therefore, I had to somehow overcome that challenge by convincing, no, this is not Naranjana Swami's things for taking care of his disciples, because there's many others disciples here besides just Naranjana Swami's disciples. So then I had to put the emphasis on that, no, others' disciples should become trained in this principle as well. Let them learn how to take care of others' disciples as well. And it's not just a disciple, a guru taking care of his disciples, but this is devotees caring for devotees. And gradually the way things evolved in Ukraine was, there are at least 20 gurus initiating in Ukraine. And most of the leaders are not even my disciples. Most of the counselors are not even my disciples. Why? Because it was devotee care. What difference does it make? Who's disciple? We're all in this together. We all have a mission together. And therefore, the person I felt that would be the best person and who really took it up was not my disciple. It was Achyuta Priya. He took it up and he understood. Yes. And he understood how to bring in others' disciples, and to help them understand that devotee care is a way to create a system of caring, not just physical care, but care in bhakti, faith in devotional service. This is the essence. Because if there's faith in devotional service, then all the other things will naturally evolve. And one of the things that Radhanath Maharaj learned from his counselor system is that if you encourage devotees to hear and chant together, if you encourage devotees to take shelter in the very simple things that Prabhupada gave us, and to shelter others in these very simple, basic activities of Krishna consciousness, if you do that, then the devotees themselves will naturally think of ways to add other ways of caring, such as physical care, emotional care. I mean, devotees created a fund. They came up with ideas themselves in Ukraine and Kiev of a Bhakti Vedanta fund. What was the Bhakti Vedanta fund? The Bhakti Vedanta fund was the devotees in the community themselves getting together. Let's all create a fund to help devotees who are having difficulties in a crisis. And they themselves took up an initiative to have a community fund to help devotees. And so devotees, instead of thinking, oh, when there's a problem, go to the temple president, he's supposed to help us with our problems. No, it's community. The community begins to take initiative to care for the community, to help each other. And when this kind of care evolves in a very natural way, it's very powerful. And this care extended from the temple level even to our festival that we used to have. I say used to have. Anyways, we'll see what happens. But the Bhakti Sangama festival evolved in the same spirit of care, Vaishnava Seva. Up until 2013, before the first conflict appeared in 2014 in Ukraine, which kind of destabilized a lot of some of our temples. In our Bhakti Sangama festival, we had 14,000 devotees attending. 14,000 devotees attending. There were no festival fees. There was no prasadam fees. And people came with a spirit to hear from senior devotees and to relish the association of senior devotees, to hear lectures, to chant, to have kirtan. And then devotees would come with a service attitude of seva. Some people would come, accommodations they had to take care of themselves. They would pay for themselves. But when you have 14,000 devotees, there's a lot of prasadam to cook. There's a lot of other expenses for a pandal, huge pandal. And to do it without fees is quite a challenge. And we moved to that kind of a format in the same spirit of care. And the result is some people would come and they would give, because they saw nobody's benefiting from this festival. Nobody's collecting profit. No temple's benefiting. Nobody's getting paid. Nobody's making any money. They saw this festival was their festival. And then people just naturally understood that to give donations to this festival means giving donations to Vaishnava Seva. And some people would give big donations. Some people, sometimes 2,000 devotees, several thousand devotees would come and they would give 10 grivna, which wasn't even, $1. for a 6-day festival for prasadam and for the whole fest. That's all they could give. And everybody would registered for the festival, and because we had to know how many devotees were coming, everyone would register for the festival because we had to know how many people to feed. And they would, at that registration, they would just give from your heart. Whatever you think you can give. Some people would give 10 grivna. Some people would give hundreds of dollars. Some devotees would even come and give hundreds of dollars to take part in a festival that they would spend most of the time serving. Either cooking or organizing or whatever it may be. It was because it was so blissful. And I give you this example. I think I gave you the example before. Is that the festivals used to be arranged so that one yatra or several yatras in this particular region would take responsibility for each day of the festival. They learned this principle from the local principle, which is in Kiev. In Kiev, our Sunday feast used to be organized by local counselor groups. And one counselor group each week would take responsibility for purchasing the boga, for cooking the feast, for serving out the feast, receiving guests, and for cleaning up. And each week it would rotate. One counselor group would take responsibility each week so that the temple devotees could be preaching. They didn't have to get involved in organizing the feast. So they learned from this principle and they applied it to the bigger festival. A yatra would take responsibility each day. Different yatras or groups of yatras would take responsibilities each day for purchasing the boga, for cutting up the boga, cooking the boga, for serving out the prasadam, cleaning up after prasadam, and washing the pots. And each day a new yatra would take responsibility. That was their service, Vaishnava Seva. So I used to go and I used to visit the teams of devotees in the kitchen, try to encourage them. They used to have kirtan during the cut-up sometimes. You know, you'd see like 200, 300 devotees cutting up potatoes and cabbage and carrots, and they would have a kirtan. They would be singing and chanting while they were cutting up. It was, for them, I remember I brought one god brother, Havi Prabhu, and he was visiting, and the Havi Prabhu, he was watching the devotees. He would come and he loved this part, to go into the kitchen to see all the devotees. And he just broke down crying. He had to leave. He said, Maharaj, forgive me. And he walked out and he was just crying and crying. He said, Maharaj, I've not seen such an attitude like this before. It's like these devotees are just serving and happy to serve. But it's how it evolved, by care. So anyways, I walked into the kitchen and it was at the end of a long day. This was at the time when there was maybe 12,000 devotees at the festival. And one devotee he was the last devotee washing these huge buckets. He was washing all the buckets, all the pots, and I was watching him. He was all by himself. And the room was filled with all these pots and buckets. I mean, it was a huge room. It's almost like the size of a warehouse. And I walked up to him. I said, "Wow, you've been working all day." He said, "Yeah, Maharaj." And I said to him, "Is there anything, is anything that you have to tell me? You want to tell me any difficulties?" And he looked at me with this expression on his face, like he was like almost like he was disturbed. And I said, "Oh." And he said, "What is it?" He said, "Maharaj, I have a complaint." And I said, "What is it?" He said, "They're only going to let me do this one day. And he was so serious. He was so serious that he was begging me, can I do this tomorrow? I've been told somebody else has this service tomorrow. Can I do it tomorrow too, please? Can you figure out a way I can do this tomorrow? And I said, okay, I'll work on it for you.
I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, and maybe we can expand upon that a bit. So it seems, if I understood you correctly, that Vaishnava Seva is born out of proper Vaishnava Sangha. Because you mentioned that Radhanath Maharaj said that we should focus on these as a community. So can you speak about the relationship between the two things, Vaishnava Sangha and Vaishnava Seva?
Yes. Vaishnava Sangha is so important because, and it begins with what is the basis of Vaishnava Sangha. Basis of Vaishnava Sangha is hearing and chanting together. And being attracted to associate in a way which is outside the realm of social interaction. Sometimes we have this conception of Vaishnava Sangha as being to be physically present doing things together with others. And sometimes when you're physically doing things together with others, you interact in a way that sometimes there's conflict. Conflict because competition. Competition is there. Prabhupada says it right in the fifth canto of the Bhagavatam. It speaks about in the verse that where Prahlad Maharaj is praying, may all living entities become free from envy. And he translates the words kala, which means envy. He translates it in the word for word translation is envious. Almost everyone. So it's there. And devotees experience that competitive spirit sometimes through social interaction and serving, quote, serving together, physically present together, doing things together. And it's essential, it's important. But the basis of Vaishnava Sangha is much chitta magata prana bodhiyakta parasparam. Vaishnava Sangha is based on the principle of hearing and chanting it together because that's the most competitionless Sangha you can exist in the association of Vaishnavas, especially when it's much chitta matagata prana bodhiyakta. You're discussing amongst yourselves. There's no dominant person. There's no competition. You're developing an attraction to hearing and chanting with each other. That's Vaishnava Sangha. And when you have relationships on the basis of Vaishnava Sangha, what happens is you begin to see Vaishnavas in a different light. Because if it's just social interaction, you start to see Vaishnavas in terms of how you socially interact with them. And when you socially interact with them, sometimes you begin to see certain things about their character that you don't like. And you focus on that more than the actual sincere soul within that you're enabled to see as a Vaishnava who has an attraction for hearing and chanting about Krishna, who's doing the same sacrifices you're doing, hearing and chanting about Krishna. And in this Vaishnava Sangha helps to increase our appreciation of Vaishnavas, which leads to Vaishnava Seva. That, without Vaishnava Sangha, what to speak of Vaishnava Seva, how it expands to those who we really appreciate when we see those who've really dedicated themselves to always telling others about Krishna, to always speaking about Krishna, who've given their whole lives to speaking such activity. This is how the devotees become absorbed in Vaishnava Seva at the festivals, because when 20, 25, 30 speakers, senior Vaishnavas come to speak continuously for 7 days, then everybody's fighting for Vaishnava Seva. Can I get on the Vaishnava Seva? You know, they're fighting. I want to serve. I want to do clothes. I want to wash the dishes. I'll tell you one story. Here's another story. This is just one of our older senior devotees who's a preacher, Mataji. She comes and preaches at our festival, and she's assigned, every senior devotee is assigned somebody to take care of them as a translator, assistant, whatever they need. And then others do the laundry, others, clean their room and everything. All the senior Vaishnavas have this kind of Vaishnava Seva group. So this Mataji, she took her plate and she wanted to wash it herself. She didn't like the idea. And when she took the plate to wash it herself, the other Vaishnavi was serving her. She said, "You don't understand." And she started crying. She said, "You just don't understand. I wait all year for this seva, and you're not letting me do it. You look what you're doing to me." And she's crying. "You're not letting me do this? Can you please understand what this is doing to my heart?" And the mother, she couldn't, she had to surrender, because this is an appreciation of Vaishnava Seva through Vaishnava Sangha. How to see Vaishnavas for what their real benefit is. There's somebody who's attracted to speaking about Krishna. They're attracted to hearing about Krishna. And because I have the same attraction, I see them from a completely different light. I should serve them. So this is the kind of mood that is generated on a small, very grassroots level in small groups. And then it's can be, if it's manifested on the grassroots level in small groups, with each group leader being trained as to how to care for the devotees, how to organize devotees in a way that they're participating in the most vital aspects of Krishna consciousness. The dati pratagrinati guyam akyati pritchati, that they get an opportunity to accept prasadam, to give prasadam. These are loving exchanges, to reveal their mind in confidence, to inquire confidentially. This is love. They're doing it on a small scale, but when it's done on a small scale, it can be very easily adapted into a much larger scale, which was the festival, which is very natural adaptation of the smaller scale, or the temple itself. It grows naturally, and the spirit grows naturally. If the emphasis is placed on Shraddha. Shraddha Shabde, what is Shraddha? Vishvas Kahi Shujita Nishchaya. Shraddha means firm, confidential, firm faith, that if I simply go on hearing and chanting about Krishna, then automatically all my subsidiary duties are fulfilled. That's Lord Chaitanya himself and Sanatana Goswami. This is Vaishnava Sangha. And as much as possible, if we can preserve that, then Vaishnava Seva becomes a very natural outgrowth of Vaishnava Sangha. And anyways, these are the things that devotees, even now under these challenging times in Ukraine, one of the binding forces that's helping the devotees through these turbulent times is, I mean, I get letters saying, I can't wait to get back, with my Sangha. I can't wait. It's my life. And anybody who writes a report to me, the first thing they write is they write to me about how they're in communication with their Sangha leader, because they keep regular communication amongst themselves. This is how we know who's where, because it's difficult to know who's where. But because devotees are tied into small Sanghas, the Sangha leader knows everybody where they are. They know who's in Western Europe. They know who's in Western Ukraine. They know who's still in Mariupol, where it's still, being. They knew exactly who they hadn't communicated with yet for the last 4 weeks, because they hadn't heard anything from them, and they knew because the yatras are organized as communities, and because they're organized as communities, the temple becomes the very natural outgrowth of the community spirit. It's a local project to develop a temple. And some of these temples all grew out of communities first. Temples second. Communities first. Hearing and chanting. Structures, they came up voluntarily by the natural growth of the commitment of the local devotees they had to their communities. So
Vaishnava Sangha was born from some really strong, intimate, Vaishnava Seva was born from very strong Vaishnava Sangha. I mean, if we take Ukraine as the example, it seems the whole yatra was kind of built on that foundation.
Over time, as much as possible of the yatra, obviously there are some devotees who have different ideals. Nobody's forced. It's voluntary, and that voluntary spirit always has to be there. And usually voluntary spirit can only be inspired and not forced. You can't legislate. So as much as possible, the voluntary spirit was inspired by the creation of this Vaishnava Sangha in smaller groups. And I would say there were some devotees who just, they looked for other ways to connect, maybe not directly through local sanghas, maybe through their spiritual masters, sanghas. Although, it's, as I said, it's not universal, but it's the predominant theme in the Ukrainian yatra, which is not minimized by the leaders, by the leadership, and which is the natural inspirational force behind Vaishnava Sangha and Vaishnava Seva. And I would say it's quite predominant in Ukraine. It's grown this way over time. And I believe that on the strength of the way it's grown, it will be its strength for the future, whatever may happen there. It will be its strength for the future, because even now, the same principles are being followed, except it's online. They had 2 years practice. This is what I tell them. Look, you had 2 years practice of the COVID pandemic, of learning how to associate online. Now you're trained in online Sangha.
Mm.
So they're having courses online, the academy online. It's still, and this was even going on after the conflict began.
So the resilience then of the Ukraine yatra, any yatra really, is based on those two principles. I mean, Vaishnava Sangha, Vaishnava Seva.
Yes, yes.
If you don't have those, then the resilience is not there.
The resilience is not there because there's no shelter.
Mm.
If there's no shelter, but if there's shelter, resilience is there because you see Krishna's hand. If you don't see Krishna's hand, which is sometimes not easy under these circumstances, it's difficult to be resilient. And definitely there are some on the other side of the spectrum who may not have experienced that shelter of Vaishnava Seva and Vaishnava Sangha to the point that they have this firm, confident faith that Krishna is always protecting them. But at least for amongst the devotees who experience that and have some taste for it and some realization of it, resilience is born of the fact that Krishna is there in my life, even in the most difficult circumstances, because he's given me something that's the most valuable asset for anyone in the material world is the association of devotees. And if I don't appreciate the association of devotees, what value is there to living in the material world? If I can't appreciate devotees, I have nothing. And they're holding on to this because they've appreciated the value. So
Thank you, Maharaj. Wonderful, wonderful. Just to wind up, is there any particular message or kind of advice or inspiration you would like to give the devotees of our yatra? I mean, be it in the context of Vaishnava Sangha or Vaishnava Seva, something that, you know.
message, if there's any message I can give, at least having been given the opportunity to speak about what I've been speaking about so far, I would say one of the obstacles that I've seen that really does need to be overcome for establishing Vaishnava Seva, Vaishnava Sangha, and Vaishnava Seva on the principles I've spoken about is when the leadership thinks that devotee care is a department of our local scheme, our management structure. Somebody's in charge of devotee care, and that somebody is responsible to see that devotee care is taking place. But I have a certain managerial vision that I don't have time for devotee care. It's his department, and if it's not happening, it's his fault. And blame him. I have a responsibility, and I have too many things to think about besides devotee care. And I'll say that if anybody appreciates the ideals of devotee care, and if they're in a leadership position, If you think like that, just forget about devotee care. It won't happen. It will not happen. Devotee care is across the boards. You may not be able to get directly involved as a manager in devotee care, but unless you understand the ideals, you understand the cooperative spirit that's required to see, and to get behind it, to support it, to not compete with it. If you start competing, it won't get off the ground. It will not get off the ground. It's not something that needs to be competed with so that your managerial ideals can be executed without compromise by devotee care department. If we think that way, I'm not saying that, it has to be the main point of focus, but what I am saying is it has to be an integral part of everyone's spirit. That if it's not seen as an integral part of everyone's spirit, then they've missed something that Prabhupada came to give, which is Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, which is the whole basis of Vaishnava Sangha. Prabhupada says, as preaching is there, management follows like a shadow. Mm. If Krishna consciousness is there, to hearing and chanting, all our managerial ideals will be fulfilled. If we actually see that this first and foremost principle is preserved in the lives of the devotees. This is real care. And this is something I would just simply humbly request that the leaders should avoid, is avoid that kind of a conception of Vaishnava care or devotee care is simply just a small part. It's one cog in the wheel of our local vision. It's not. It's the whole vision, the collective vision, which is shared by devotees who serve with each other in a mood of Vaishnava Seva, appreciation, because they have Vaishnava Sangha. They can serve with each other as Vaishnava Seva and cooperate for a higher goal, to spread Prabhupada's magic.
So the whole culture of devotee care and the systems and everything is born from the consciousness of devotee care. If the consciousness is not there, as you said, it's never going to get off the ground.
It won't get off the ground. It won't get off the ground. Sometimes, I'll end with one thing. In the course of my travels, people oftentimes ask me about, can you tell me something about the devotee care system? And the first thing I tell them is that systems don't care for devotees. Devotees do. I says, if you want a successful devotees care system, the first thing you have to do is care for devotees. If you don't care for devotees, no system's going to take care of them. That's how I introduced the subject.
Very pertinent point. Because I can see it's sometimes like that. We're always looking for some, newfangled system. It's going to, take care of all the problems, and so like that, devotee care is a department. If we have this newfangled system, it's going to take care of all of the problems, and we don't have to worry about it, the system's going to solve all the problems for us.
Right? Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, even that thought is really, really impersonal just on its own.
You're following the rules and regulations of devotional service simply for the purpose of following without understanding the goals of it.
Yeah.
Right? Niyamagraha?
Niranjan Mars, it's been a real pleasure. And we want to thank you on behalf of the 200 and some devotees who have been listening this morning and hundreds more who will listen later on. Thank you so much for giving the time and sharing your heart, telling us all about yourself as the person and the whole devotee care system and the whole kind of evolution of the yatra. It was really a very enriching experience.
What was enriching for me, Maharaj, is the association I'm getting with you. It's been my inspiration throughout this whole opportunity to speak. Seeing that you genuinely embody these ideals, and therefore it was because of your genuine embodiment of these ideals that's inspiring me to speak about something that I know is there in your heart. So thanking you for giving me this opportunity, Maharaj, to have this sangha.
I was feeling the exact same thing. Exact same thing. So tells me we need to spend a little more time together, even though we're serving in opposite places in the world. I'm going to be in contact with you seriously soon. All right.
Thank you for your opportunities to be in your association, Maharaj, and for giving me this opportunity to share some
Thank
of
you.
my small realizations I have in being a servant to Srila Prabhupada.
All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Jai, Hare Krishna, glories to Prabhupada.
Thank you all devotees. Hare Krishna.